Young woman marries 80-year-old man for his millionaire inheritance. She is shocked when reading the will in front of everyone. Before the story begins, comment below which city you're watching this video from. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Enjoy the story, everyone. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 7 times, its resonant tones echoing through the cavernous rooms of the Williams estate. Frank Williams sat in his leather armchair by the window, watching as the last rays of the Texas sun painted the sky in hues of amber and gold over the sprawling ranch property on the outskirts of San Antonio. Martha would have loved this sunset, he whispered to himself, his weathered hand clutching the silver-framed photograph that never left his side. His fingers traced the outline of her face, the glass cool against his skin. 6 months had passed since Martha had left this world, but for Frank it might as well have been yesterday. 52 years of marriage, gone in an instant. The doctors had called it a sudden cardiac event. Quick and painless, they assured him. Small comfort for the man left behind. Frank set down his untouched glass of bourbon and shifted uncomfortably in his seat. At 78, his body reminded him daily of its limitations. The successful auto dealership empire he had built from nothing, Williams Motors with 12 locations across Texas, now seemed meaningless without someone to share it with. The sprawling 5-bedroom ranch house that once buzzed with Martha's energy now stood silent, save for the ticking of clocks and the occasional creak of settling foundation. No children to visit, no grandchildren to brighten the hallways, just Frank and his memories. "Mr. Williams?" a soft voice called from the doorway. "I brought your dinner." Margaret Johnson, his 65-year-old neighbor who lived in the adjacent property, had taken to checking on him daily since Martha's passing. A widow herself, she understood the crushing weight of solitude better than most. "Thank you, Margaret, but I'm not hungry tonight," Frank replied, not turning from the window. Margaret sighed, setting the covered plate on the side table anyway. "You need to eat something, Frank. Martha would have my hide if she knew I was letting you waste away." A ghost of a smile crossed Frank's face. Martha and Margaret had been close friends for decades, united in their love of gardening and their exasperation with their husband's shared obsession with classic cars. "I'll eat later," he promised, knowing he probably wouldn't. Margaret studied him with concern etched across her face. "How about I come by tomorrow and help you sort through some of those papers in the study?" "It's been 6 months, Frank. Martha wouldn't want you to put your life on hold forever." "What life?" The words escaped before he could catch them, hanging heavily in the air between them. Margaret approached, laying a gentle hand on his shoulder. "The one you still have ahead of you, the one she'd want you to live fully." After Margaret left, Frank struggled to his feet, joints protesting with each movement. He shuffled toward the bathroom, flipping on lights as he went. The house was too big for him now, too empty, too full of memories. In the bathroom, he reached for his medication, the orange prescription bottles lined up neatly on the counter. Martha's doing, a system she had established before she was gone. His hands trembled as he tried to open the child-proof cap on his heart medication. The bottle slipped from his grasp, plastic rattling as pills scattered across the marble tiles. Frank cursed under his breath and leaned down to retrieve them, but the sudden movement threw him off balance. He reached for the towel rack to steady himself, but his fingers only grazed the metal bar. The fall happened in slow motion, a moment suspended in time where Frank realized that, for the first time in his adult life, there was no one to catch him. His head struck the edge of the bathtub with a sickening thud, and darkness consumed his vision. When consciousness returned, Frank found himself sprawled on the cold bathroom floor, a sharp pain radiating from his hip. The overhead light seemed unnaturally bright, making him squint as he tried to orient himself. How long had he been there? Minutes, hours. He attempted to push himself up, but his body wouldn't cooperate. The pain intensified with each movement, forcing a groan from his lips. His cell phone was in the bedroom, might as well have been miles away. "Help!" he called out, his voice weaker than he expected. "Somebody help!" But there was no one to hear him in the empty house. Frank lay there, vulnerable and alone, as the reality of his situation crashed over him like a wave. This was his greatest fear realized. Not death itself, but dying alone. Forgotten, with no one to mourn him, no one to carry on his name. Martha had wanted children so desperately. They both had. But after years of trying and countless consultations with specialists, They had to accept the painful truth of Martha's infertility. Frank had assured her it didn't matter, that she was enough for him, and she had been. But now, in the cold solitude of his bathroom floor, Frank wondered what might have been different if they'd had a family. As twilight deepened into night, Frank's thoughts drifted to the family business he had built from nothing. Williams Motors would likely be sold off piece by piece when he was gone. No heir to carry on his legacy, no child to pass on the stories of how he'd started with a single used car lot and a dream. Just as despair threatened to overwhelm him, the distant sound of the doorbell pierced the silence, then knocking growing more insistent with each moment. "Frank, are you in there? It's Margaret." Relief washed over him like a warm tide. "In the bathroom," he called out, his voice stronger now. "I've fallen." He heard the sound of a key in the lock, the spare he'd given Martha years ago for emergencies, which she must have passed to Margaret, followed by hurried footsteps. "Oh my God, Frank!" Margaret appeared in the doorway, her face pale with shock. Behind her stood a young man Frank recognized as her grandson, home visiting from college. "Don't just stand there, Jason. Help me get him up," Margaret directed, already kneeling beside Frank despite her own arthritic knees. Together, they carefully helped Frank to a seated position. "I'm calling an ambulance," Margaret stated firmly, leaving no room for argument. "No hospitals," Frank protested. "Just help me to bed. I'll be fine by morning." Margaret fixed him with a stern look that reminded him so much of Martha that he almost smiled. "Frank Williams, you're going to the hospital if I have to drag you there myself. No arguments." Later that night, in a sterile hospital room with machines beeping a steady rhythm beside him, Frank lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The doctor had confirmed a hairline fracture in his hip, not severe enough to require surgery, but enough to necessitate weeks of limited mobility and rehabilitation. "You're lucky Mrs. Johnson found you when she did," the doctor had said. "Living alone at your age with this kind of injury, you might want to consider some in-home help." Frank's pride had wanted to dismiss the suggestion immediately, but the memory of those helpless hours on the bathroom floor silenced his protest. He wasn't getting any younger, and his body was becoming a stranger to him, unpredictable, unreliable. As he drifted towards sleep, his thoughts turned again to Martha. What would she advise him to do? The answer came easily, in her practical, no-nonsense voice. "Accept help when you need it, Frank. There's no shame in that." With that thought comforting him like a warm blanket, Frank Williams closed his eyes, unaware that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. 3 days later, Frank found himself back in his own bed, his pride wounded, but his resolve strengthened. The hospital discharge papers lay on his nightstand, alongside a new collection of prescription bottles, painkillers, anti-inflammatories, and something to help him sleep. Margaret had insisted on staying in the guest bedroom for the first night, but Frank knew she had her own life to live. He couldn't impose on her indefinitely. A soft knock on the door drew his attention. Margaret entered carrying a tray with toast, scrambled eggs, and orange juice. "You don't have to wait on me hand and foot," Frank grumbled, though he was secretly grateful for her presence. "I know I don't," Margaret replied, setting the tray across his lap. "But someone needs to, at least until you're back on your feet." She sat in the armchair by the window, her expression thoughtful. "Which is actually what I wanted to talk to you about." Frank raised an eyebrow as he took a cautious sip of orange juice. "I'm listening." "You need help, Frank. More than I can provide on my own." She held up a hand to silence his protest before it began. "And before you start talking about retirement homes or assisted living facilities, that's not what I'm suggesting." Relief washed over Frank. The thought of leaving his home, the home he'd built with Martha where every corner held memories of her, was unbearable. "What are you suggesting then?" he asked, setting down his glass. "A professional caregiver, someone who could live here, help with your recovery, keep the house in order, and most importantly, be here if you fall again." Margaret's tone was gentle but firm. "I've already made some inquiries with a reputable agency." Frank frowned, pushing the tray away despite having barely touched his food. "I don't need a babysitter, Margaret. No, you need a trained professional who can help you regain your independence," she countered. "Think about it, Frank. If you don't heal properly from this injury, it could affect your mobility permanently. Is your pride worth that risk?" Frank stared out the window at the sprawling oak tree that had been there since before he and Martha bought the property. How many summer afternoons had they spent in its shade planning their future? A future that had never included him being old and alone, dependent on strangers. "Would Martha want you to refuse help out of stubbornness?" Margaret asked softly, as if reading his thoughts. Frank sighed, defeat evident in the slump of his shoulders. "Fine. I'll meet with someone from the agency, but I have final say on who comes into my home." Margaret smiled, patting his hand. "That's all I ask. They're sending someone over tomorrow at 10. Her name is Andrea Parker, and she comes highly recommended." The next morning, Frank insisted on getting dressed properly, despite the pain it caused him. He sat in his study, surrounded by photographs of his younger self alongside various cars from his dealerships, awards from the Chamber of Commerce, and of course, countless pictures of Martha. He wanted whoever this Andrea was to see him as a successful businessman, not just a frail old man. At precisely 10 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Margaret, who had arrived early to help Frank prepare, answered it promptly. Frank heard muffled voices in the hallway before Margaret appeared in the doorway of his study, followed by a young woman who couldn't have been more than 25. She had chestnut hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, intelligent hazel eyes, and a smile that seemed to brighten the room. "Mr. Williams, this is Andrea Parker," Margaret introduced. "Andrea Frank Williams. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Williams," Andrea said, stepping forward with her hand extended. Her voice carried a slight southern accent that reminded Frank of his own mother. "Everyone calls me Andy." Frank accepted her handshake, surprised by the firmness of her grip. "Frank is fine," he replied, studying her carefully. She was dressed professionally in navy slacks and a crisp white blouse, a modest silver necklace her only adornment. "I'll leave you two to talk," Margaret said, excusing herself with a meaningful look at Frank that clearly said, "Give her a chance." Andrea took the seat opposite Frank's desk without waiting to be invited, her posture perfect but relaxed. "So, Frank, why don't you tell me about yourself?" Frank raised an eyebrow. "Shouldn't I be the one interviewing you?" Andrea laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to dispel some of the tension in the room. "Fair enough. But in my experience, the best way to know if we'll be a good fit is to have a conversation, not an interrogation. I already know the basics. Successful auto dealer, recent widower, hairline, hip fracture that needs monitoring. What I don't know is what makes Frank Williams tick." There was something refreshingly direct about her approach that caught Frank off guard. Most people tiptoed around him these days, especially when mentioning Martha. "I built Williams Motors from the ground up," he found himself saying. "Started with 1 lot and 3 cars I fixed up myself. Now we have 12 dealerships across Texas." Andrea nodded, her expression genuinely interested. "Impressive. Self-made man. Do you still work?" "Semi-retired," Frank admitted. "My CFO handles most day-to-day operations, but I still review the major decisions. Or I did, until this." He gestured to his hip. "And you live alone now?" Andrea asked, her tone gentle but not pitying. "Yes. My wife Martha passed 6 months ago." Even saying the words out loud sent a pang through his chest that had nothing to do with his physical injury. Andrea's expression softened. "I'm truly sorry for your loss. Was it a long marriage?" 52 years, Frank replied, his gaze drifting to the photograph on his desk. He and Martha on their 50th anniversary, her smile still as radiant as the day they met. "That's remarkable," Andrea said with genuine admiration. "Not many people get to experience that kind of enduring love." For the next hour, Frank found himself sharing stories about Martha, about building his business, about the classic car collection housed in his garage that he hadn't had the heart to look at since her passing. Andrea listened attentively, asking thoughtful questions that revealed her intelligence and empathy. In turn, she told him about her nursing training, her previous experience caring for elderly clients, and her passion for helping people maintain their dignity and independence as they aged. "What about family?" Frank asked eventually. "Won't they miss you if you're living here?" A shadow crossed Andrea's face briefly. "My parents passed away in a car accident when I was 19. It's just me and my brother Ethan now. He had a spinal injury a few years back. He can walk, but he needs surgery to correct some complications." She shrugged, trying to appear casual, though Frank could see the concern in her eyes. Insurance won't cover it, so I've been saving up. Frank nodded sympathetically. That must be difficult for you both. We manage, Andrea replied with a small smile. Ethan's stubborn and independent, probably why we butt heads so often. But he's all I've got. As their conversation wound down, Frank realized with some surprise that he had enjoyed talking with Andrea. There was something about her that put him at ease. Perhaps it was her straightforwardness, or maybe it was simply the fact that she treated him like a person rather than a patient. Well, Frank said finally, I suppose we should discuss practical matters. What exactly would your duties entail if I were to hire you? Andrea leaned forward, her expression becoming more professional. I'd help with your physical recovery, making sure you do your prescribed exercises, monitoring your medications, assisting with mobility as needed. I'd also handle light housekeeping, meal preparation, and drive you to appointments. Most importantly, I'd be here in case of emergencies. She paused, meeting his gaze directly. But my primary goal would be to help you regain your independence, not take it away. Frank nodded slowly, considering her words. And the living arrangement? The agency suggested I take one of your guest rooms to be available around the clock. I'd need some personal time off, of course, everyone does, but we can work out a schedule that ensures you're never left alone for too long. Frank glanced at the doorway, where he could see Margaret hovering, pretending not to eavesdrop. He sighed, knowing she'd badger him endlessly if he didn't at least give this arrangement a try. All right, Ms. Parker. Andy. Let's give it a 2-week trial and see how it goes. Andrea's smile was like sunshine breaking through clouds. You won't regret it, Frank. I promise you that. As she left to retrieve her belongings from her car, Margaret entered the study with a knowing smile. She seems perfect, doesn't she? She'll do for now, Frank conceded, unwilling to admit how much he had liked the young woman. It's just temporary, until I'm back on my feet. Margaret simply nodded, though her expression suggested she knew better. Of course it is. Later that evening, as Frank lay in bed listening to Andrea settling into the guest room across the hall, he found himself wondering how this young woman would change his quiet, lonely life. For the first time since Martha's passing, he felt a flicker of something that might have been hope. Perhaps having someone in the house again wouldn't be so bad after all. The Texas summer heat settled over San Antonio like a heavy blanket, but inside Frank's ranch house a new routine was taking shape. 2 weeks had turned into a month, and Andrea, Andy, as she insisted everyone call her, had seamlessly integrated herself into Frank's daily life. Each morning began with Frank's medications delivered, alongside a perfectly brewed cup of coffee, black with just a hint of sugar, exactly the way he liked it. After breakfast, they would work through his physical therapy exercises in the sunroom, overlooking the garden Martha had once lovingly tended. You're pushing yourself too hard, Andy cautioned one morning as Frank grimaced through a particularly challenging stretch. Recovery isn't a race. Tell that to my body, Frank grumbled, wiping sweat from his brow. I've never been good at sitting still. Andy smiled, adjusting his position with gentle hands. From what Margaret tells me, you built your first dealership while working 2 other jobs. Sitting still definitely isn't your strong suit. Frank raised an eyebrow. You and Margaret have been talking about me? She cares about you, Andy replied simply. And she tells great stories. Like how you once traded a rare classic car for the land where your main dealership stands now, against everyone's advice. Best decision I ever made, Frank said with a hint of pride. Everyone thought I was crazy, that Shelby Cobra was worth a fortune, but I saw the potential in that corner lot. 6 months later, we had the highest-selling dealership in the county. Andy helped him to his feet, supporting his weight as he reached for his walker. What was your second-best decision? Frank didn't hesitate. Marrying Martha. She believed in me when no one else did. Worked the phones at that first dealership while pregnant with... He stopped abruptly, the memory hitting him like a physical blow. Andy watched him carefully. Frank, are you all right? He nodded stiffly, closing his eyes briefly against the wave of grief. Just an old memory. Martha miscarried early in our marriage. We tried for years after that, but he trailed off, surprised at himself for sharing something so personal. Andy's expression softened with genuine compassion. I'm so sorry, Frank. That must have been devastating for you both. Martha couldn't have children, Frank said quietly, the words still painful even after all these years. We looked into adoption, but the timing was never right with the business taking off. Then years passed, and suddenly we were too old according to the agencies. He shook his head. Our biggest regret was never having a family to pass everything on to. They made their way slowly to the kitchen, where Andy had set out ingredients for lunch. Frank eased himself into a chair at the counter to watch her work. There was something soothing about her efficient movements as she chopped vegetables for a salad. "Do you want children someday?" Frank asked abruptly. Andy's knife paused mid-chop. A shadow crossed her face. "I can't have children either." Frank straightened, surprised by this unexpected connection between them. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have pried." "It's all right," Andy said, resuming her chopping with slightly more force than necessary. "I found out when I was 22. Endometriosis. The doctors tried everything, but eventually they had to perform a hysterectomy. Sometimes I think it's why my fiancé left." She shrugged, attempting to appear casual, though Frank could see the hurt in her eyes. "Some men can't handle the idea of not having biological children." "His loss," Frank said firmly. "Any man worth his salt would stay for love, children or no children." Andy smiled gratefully. "That's exactly what Martha would have said, isn't it?" Frank nodded, feeling a strange warmth spread through his chest. This young woman seemed to understand him in a way few people did anymore. As the weeks passed, their bond deepened. Andy listened patiently as Frank shared stories of his life with Martha, their early struggles, the thrill of success when the business finally took off, the trips they'd taken around the world. In turn, she told him about her dreams of eventually opening a small elder care facility focused on maintaining dignity and independence for its residents. "Not a nursing home," she explained one evening as they sat on the porch, watching fireflies dance across the lawn. "More like a community where seniors could have their own space, but with support available when needed." "Sounds like a worthwhile venture," Frank commented, impressed by her vision. "There's certainly a need for it," Andy nodded enthusiastically. "The problem is startup capital. Property costs alone would be astronomical, not to mention staffing and insurance." "Have you looked into business loans?" Frank asked, his entrepreneurial mind automatically analyzing the problem. "My credit isn't great," Andy admitted. "Student loans and medical bills for Ethan wiped out my savings. Banks don't exactly line up to loan money to 25-year-olds with debt." "I might be able to help," Frank offered, surprising himself. "I know people at several banks. Could make some introductions when you're ready." The smile she gave him was radiant. "That would be amazing, Frank, thank you." Their days fell into a comfortable rhythm. Frank's mobility improved steadily under Andy's attentive care. By the second month, he had progressed from a walker to a cane, and his pain had diminished significantly. On Sundays, Margaret would join them for dinner, bringing her famous peach cobbler and news from around the neighborhood. "You're looking better every time I see you," Margaret remarked one Sunday evening as they sat in the living room after dinner. "Andy must be taking good care of you." "She is," Frank agreed, glancing fondly at the young woman who was clearing dishes from the dining room. "I don't know what I'd do without her at this point." Margaret's expression grew serious. "Have you thought about what happens when you're fully recovered? Will she move on to another client?" The question caught Frank off guard. He hadn't considered Andy's eventual departure, though he knew it was inevitable. The thought left him with an unexpected hollow feeling. "I suppose she will," he said slowly. "That's her job, after all." Margaret studied him carefully. "You've grown attached to her." "She's good company," Frank replied defensively. "And she's helpful around the house." Margaret hummed skeptically. "Just be careful, Frank. She's very young and you're in a vulnerable position." "What exactly are you implying?" Frank's tone sharpened. Margaret sighed. "Nothing specific. I just worry about you. After Martha, well, loneliness can make people susceptible." "Andy isn't taking advantage of me, if that's what you're suggesting," Frank said firmly. "She's a professional doing her job, and she does it well." The conversation was interrupted by Andy's return with coffee. If she had overheard any part of their discussion, she gave no indication of it. Instead, she smoothly steered the conversation toward Margaret's upcoming garden club competition, effectively diffusing the tension. Later that night, after Margaret had gone home and Andy had helped Frank prepare for bed, he found himself unable to sleep. Margaret's concerns echoed in his mind, forcing him to examine his feelings about his caregiver. Had he grown too dependent on her presence? Was it merely the relief of having someone in the house again after months of crushing solitude? Or was it something more? The unexpected connection they shared, the understanding that seemed to transcend their age difference. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at his bedroom door. "Frank, are you awake?" Andy's voice was hesitant. "Come in," he called, propping himself up against his pillows. Andy entered, already dressed in her pajamas, modest flannel pants and a University of Texas t-shirt. She held her phone in her hand, her expression troubled. "I'm sorry to bother you so late, but I just got a call from my brother," she said, perching on the edge of his bed. "Ethan's doctor called with his latest test results. They're saying he needs that surgery sooner rather than later. There are complications they're concerned about." Frank frowned with concern. "How much sooner?" "Within the next 2 months, ideally." Andy ran a hand through her loose hair, a gesture Frank had come to recognize as a sign of her anxiety. "I'm nowhere near having enough saved yet. I'm going to have to pick up extra shifts somehow, maybe find a second job on my days off." "How much do you need?" Frank asked. Andy shook her head. "It's not your problem, Frank. I shouldn't have bothered you with this. I just needed to vent, I guess." "Andy," Frank said gently, "how much?" She sighed, looking down at her hands. "About $40,000. The procedure itself is expensive, and then there's the hospital stay, physical therapy afterward." Frank was quiet for a moment, considering. It was a substantial sum, but one he could easily afford. The question was whether offering would be crossing a line in their professional relationship. "Let me help," he said finally. "I can loan you the money." Andy's head snapped up, her eyes wide. "Frank, no, that's way too much. I couldn't possibly accept that." "It's just a loan," Frank insisted. "You can pay me back when you're able. No interest, no timeline." "Why would you do that for me?" Andy asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Frank thought about Martha, about the countless people they had helped over the years, employees facing medical crises, customers who needed a break on payments during hard times. Martha had always believed in paying forward their good fortune. "Because I can," he said simply, "and because I believe in you, Andy. I believe you'll make that elder care facility a reality someday, and you'll help a lot of people. Consider this an investment in that future." Tears welled in Andy's eyes. Without warning, she leaned forward and hugged him tightly. "Thank you," she whispered against his shoulder. "I don't know how to repay your kindness." "Just keep being you," Frank replied, awkwardly patting her back. "That's enough." As Andy pulled away, wiping tears from her cheeks, Frank felt a curious lightness in his chest. For the first time since Martha's passing, he felt truly needed again, not as a patient, but as someone who could make a difference in another person's life. What he didn't see was the calculating gleam that replaced the tears in Andy's eyes as she turned to leave the room, or the satisfied smile that curved her lips as she closed his door behind her. 3 months into Andrea's employment, Frank's life had transformed in ways he never anticipated. His physical recovery had progressed remarkably well, the cane now only necessary for longer walks or particularly tiring days. But the changes went far beyond his improved mobility. The house, once a mausoleum of memories, now felt alive again. Andy had gradually refreshed rooms without erasing Martha's touches, rearranging furniture to improve accessibility, adding fresh flowers to brighten dark corners, playing soft music in the evenings. She'd even convinced Frank to visit his classic car collection in the detached garage, helping him polish the chrome on his prized 1965 Mustang one sunny afternoon. "Martha always said these cars were your other children," Frank remarked as they worked side by side, the familiar scent of leather conditioner and polish bringing back a flood of memories. Andy smiled, carefully buffing the dashboard. "She was right. You know every detail about each one. The way you talk about them, it's like describing family members." Frank nodded, surprised by the lack of pain that accompanied thoughts of Martha these days. The sharp grief had gradually mellowed into something more tender, a bittersweet acknowledgement of a beautiful past, rather than an open wound. "The check cleared for Ethan's surgery," Andy mentioned, changing the subject. "He's scheduled for next Tuesday." "That's wonderful news," Frank replied sincerely. "Will you be going to Houston to be with him?" Andy nodded. "Just for a few days. Margaret said she'd stay here with you." Frank waved a dismissive hand. "I'm perfectly capable of managing on my own now, thanks to your excellent care, but I appreciate Margaret's concern." "It's not just concern," Andy said, setting down her polishing cloth. "She cares about you. A lot of people do, Frank. You've built quite a life here." That evening, after Andy had gone to her room for the night, Frank sat in his study contemplating her words. He had built a good life, a successful business, a beautiful home, a marriage most people only dreamed of. But Martha's absence still left a void that echoed through his days. And soon Andy would leave too. Once she repaid the loan for Ethan's surgery, she'd move on to another client, another home. The thought unsettled him more than he cared to admit. The following week passed in a blur of preparations for Andy's absence. She prepared meals in advance, organized his medications into clearly labeled containers, and left detailed instructions for Margaret. Her efficiency was impressive, her thoughtfulness touching. "I'll only be gone for 3 days," she laughed as she caught Frank studying the comprehensive care binder she'd created. "Not 3 months." "Better safe than sorry," Frank replied with a smile. "Your brother is lucky to have you, Andy." Something flickered in her eyes, an emotion Frank couldn't quite identify. "Family is everything," she said softly. "Something I think you understand better than most." The morning of her departure, Frank insisted on driving her to the airport despite her protests. "You haven't driven in months," she pointed out, as he carefully backed the Lincoln Navigator out of the garage. "All the more reason to practice," he countered. "Besides, I don't trust those rideshare services." The drive to San Antonio International Airport was filled with comfortable conversation about Ethan's prognosis and expected recovery timeline. At the departure terminal, Frank surprised himself by feeling genuinely emotional about their temporary separation. "Call me when you land," he instructed, as Andy retrieved her small suitcase from the back seat. "And let me know how the surgery goes." "I will," she promised, hesitating briefly before leaning over to kiss his cheek. "Take care of yourself, Frank. I'll be back before you know it." He watched her walk into the terminal, a petite figure soon swallowed by the bustling crowd. Something inside him ached at the sight, a loneliness already creeping back despite knowing her absence was temporary. Margaret arrived at the house that afternoon bearing casseroles and concerned glances. "You're awfully quiet," she observed as they ate dinner. "Missing Andy already?" Frank grunted non-committally, pushing food around his plate. "Just tired. Driving to the airport took more out of me than I expected." Margaret studied him over the rim of her water glass. "Frank Williams, I've known you for 30 years. You're not just tired," he sighed, setting down his fork. "I've been thinking about what happens when I'm fully recovered. Andy will move on to another client who needs her more." "And that bothers you?" Margaret stated rather than asked. "She's become—" Frank searched for the right word. "Important to me." Margaret's expression softened with understanding and something that might have been pity. "Oh, Frank, you have feelings for her, don't you?" "Not the way you're implying," he said defensively, though even as he spoke, he questioned his own certainty. "She's young enough to be my granddaughter, for heaven's sake." "Age isn't always the most important factor," Margaret replied gently. "But there are other considerations. She's your employee, Frank. She depends on you financially. That creates a power imbalance that can't be ignored." Frank frowned, offended by the implication. "I would never take advantage of that." "Not intentionally," Margaret agreed. "But there are many kinds of vulnerability. Just be careful. For both your sakes." The conversation left Frank restless and irritable. After Margaret went home, he found himself wandering through the quiet house, hyper-aware of Andy's absence in every room. Her coffee mug in the dish drainer, the light blanket she kept on the living room couch for chilly evenings, the faint scent of her perfume, something subtle with notes of vanilla that lingered in the hallway. Frank stopped at the door to her bedroom, hesitating before pushing it open. He'd never entered her space before, respecting her privacy as she respected his. The room was neat, almost impersonal, except for a few photographs on the dresser. One showed Andy with a young man in a wheelchair, Ethan, presumably. Another featured a middle-aged couple that must have been her parents. He closed the door feeling like an intruder despite owning the house. In his study, he poured himself a small bourbon, his first since before his fall, and settled into his leather chair. Martha's photograph watched him from the desk, her smile knowing and gentle. "What would you think of all this?" he asked the empty room. "Of Andy, of me, feeling whatever this is." The next morning, Frank's phone chimed with a text message from Andy. "Surgery successful, Ethan in recovery. Everything looking good so far." Relief washed over him, followed by a wave of warmth at the simple fact that she'd remembered to update him, despite what must have been a stressful day. He typed a reply, deleted it, then typed again, feeling strangely like a teenager. Excellent news. Tell Ethan I'm pulling for him. Take care of yourself too. The 3 days of Andy's absence crawled by with agonizing slowness. Margaret visited daily, but her company, while pleasant, wasn't the same. Frank found himself counting the hours until Andy's return, a fact that both disturbed and fascinated him. When had she become so essential to his daily life? And what did that mean for his future? On the afternoon of Andy's return, Frank insisted on picking her up himself despite Margaret's offers to drive. He arrived at the airport early, parking in the short-term lot and making his way to the arrivals area with careful steps. When Andy emerged from the security gates, her face lighting up at the sight of him, Frank felt something shift inside him. A certainty, a decision crystallizing. "You didn't have to come yourself," she chided as they walked to the car, her hand resting lightly on his arm in a gesture that had become natural between them. "I wanted to," Frank replied simply. During the drive home, Andy filled him in on Ethan's surgery and prognosis. "The doctors are optimistic. The procedure went even better than expected. He'll need physical therapy, but they believe he'll regain almost full mobility." "That's wonderful news," Frank said sincerely. "And the money I loaned you, was it enough to cover everything?" Andy nodded, her expression solemn. "More than enough. Frank, I can't tell you what that meant to Ethan. To both of us. No one has ever done anything like that for us before." "I'm glad I could help," he said, keeping his eyes on the road. "You've done more for me than you know, Andy. Before you came, I was just existing, going through the motions. You brought life back into my home. Into me." Out of the corner of his eye, he saw her watching him with an unreadable expression. "That's my job," she said softly, "to help you regain your independence." "And you've done that," Frank acknowledged, "which means soon you'll move on to someone else who needs you more." Andy was quiet for a long moment. "Yes," she finally said, "that's how it works." They drove in silence for several minutes, the Texas landscape rolling by outside the windows. Frank's mind raced with thoughts he'd been turning over during her absence. Possibilities, risks, hopes. "Unless," he said finally, "there was a reason for you to stay." Andy turned to look at him fully now. "What kind of reason?" Frank took a deep breath. "What if I asked you to stay permanently? Not as my caregiver, but as my companion?" Her eyes widened slightly. "Frank, what exactly are you saying?" He pulled the car into a scenic overlook area just off the highway, putting it in park before turning to face her. "I'm not proposing love or romance, Andy. I'm too old for that, and you're too young. But I am proposing a partnership, a mutual arrangement that could benefit us both." "I don't understand," she said, though something in her expression suggested she might. "Marry me," Frank said, the words surprising even himself with their directness. "Become my wife in name, my companion in practice. I'll provide financial security, enough to pay back the loan for Ethan's surgery, enough to start that elder care facility you dream about. In return, you continue doing what you've already been doing, keeping me company, helping around the house as needed." Andy stared at him, speechless for perhaps the first time since he'd known her. "I know it sounds crazy," Frank continued, needing to fill the silence. "But I've thought about this carefully. I don't have children or grandchildren. When I die, which, let's face it, will be sooner rather than later, everything I've built will go to distant relatives who never bothered to visit even when Martha was alive. Why not leave it to someone who's actually made a difference in my life?" "Frank," Andy began, her voice hesitant, "this is unexpected." "Think about it," he urged. "You wouldn't have to answer to the agency anymore. You'd be free to pursue your own projects, help your brother, build that facility. All I ask is that you don't leave me to face my final years alone." Andy's expression cycled through confusion, surprise, and something that might have been calculation before settling on cautious interest. "People would talk," she said finally. "The age difference? Let them talk," Frank dismissed with a wave of his hand. "I've never cared much for other people's opinions, and at my age I care even less." "What about Margaret?" Andy asked. "She'd assume I was taking advantage of you." Frank chuckled. "Margaret already thinks that. She'll come around eventually when she sees nothing has really changed between us." Andy looked down at her hands, folded neatly in her lap. "Can I think about it?" "Of course," Frank said, relief washing over him that she hadn't immediately rejected the idea. Take all the time you need. It's not a decision to make lightly. He started the car again, pulling back onto the highway toward home. They rode in contemplative silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Frank wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake, if he'd jeopardized the comfortable relationship they'd established. But the die was cast now. All he could do was wait for her answer, and hope he hadn't misread the connection between them. As they turned onto his street, Andy finally spoke. "Yes." Frank nearly missed the turn into his driveway. "What?" "Yes," she repeated, more firmly this time. "I'll marry you, Frank, on the conditions you outlined. A partnership of mutual benefit and companionship." Frank parked the car in the garage, turning to look at her with barely concealed astonishment. "You don't need more time to consider," Andy smiled, reaching over to squeeze his hand. "Sometimes you just know when something is right. You've been nothing but kind and generous to me. Why wouldn't I want to continue being part of your life? And if I can help build a legacy that honors both you and Martha, all the better." Something in her easy acceptance should have given Frank pause, but the relief and joy of having an answer, a positive answer, overwhelmed any lingering doubts. He lifted her hand to his lips in an old-fashioned gesture that felt right for the moment. "Thank you, Andy. I promise you won't regret this." Her smile widened, revealing perfect white teeth. "I know I won't," she replied, with a certainty that, had Frank been less caught up in the moment, might have sounded almost predatory. The wedding was a simple affair at the county courthouse, with only Margaret and Ethan as witnesses. Margaret had been predictably horrified when Frank announced his intentions, her concerns ranging from the practical, "Have you considered a prenuptial agreement?" to the emotional, "Are you sure this isn't just grief talking?" But Frank had been resolute, and Andy had been gracious in the face of Margaret's barely concealed suspicion. Ethan, still recovering from his surgery, but moving with noticeably improved mobility, had watched the proceedings with an enigmatic expression. He was handsome in a brooding way, with the same hazel eyes as his sister, but none of her warmth. When Frank had shaken his hand after the ceremony, Ethan's grip had been firm to the point of discomfort. "Take care of my sister," he'd said, his tone making it sound more like a warning than a request. "I intend to," Frank had replied evenly. Now, 2 months into their unconventional marriage, Frank found himself adjusting to yet another new normal. Publicly, they maintained the appearance of a May-December romance. Andy on his arm at charity events, both ignoring the whispers and raised eyebrows of San Antonio's social elite. Privately, their arrangement continued much as before, with separate bedrooms and a companionable relationship that, while affectionate, remained platonic. The most significant change was in Andy's schedule. No longer constrained by the caregiving agency's requirements, she had begun pursuing her own interests. She enrolled in business classes at the local community college, joined the board of a senior advocacy nonprofit, and spent long hours developing plans for her elder care facility. Frank had connected her with his attorney and financial advisors, helping her navigate the complex regulatory landscape of healthcare ventures. Frank found himself genuinely enjoying this new phase of their relationship. There was something deeply satisfying about mentoring Andy, about seeing her confidence grow as she stepped into the role of businesswoman. Their dinner conversations now revolved around market analysis and property zoning, rather than his physical therapy progress. But there were subtle shifts that occasionally gave him pause. Andy was absent more frequently, often citing meetings or research that kept her away from home late into the evening. She had become protective of her phone, stepping out of rooms to take calls, and there were moments when he caught her watching him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher, something calculating beneath her usual warmth. Margaret, of course, noticed these changes too. During their weekly dinners, which had continued despite her initial disapproval of the marriage, she would study Andy with narrowed eyes, especially when the younger woman's attention was elsewhere. "She's certainly busy these days," Margaret remarked during one such dinner, after Andy had excused herself to take a phone call on the patio. "Does she ever tell you who keeps calling during our meals?" Frank shrugged, trying to appear unconcerned. "Business associates, I assume. She's networking for her facility project." Margaret made a non-committal sound. "At 9 o'clock on a Sunday." Before Frank could respond, Andy returned, slipping her phone into her pocket with an apologetic smile. "Sorry about that. Where were we? The conversation moved on, but Frank found Margaret's observation lingering in his mind. That night, after everyone had gone home and Andy had retired to her room, he sat in his study contemplating the subtle changes in their household. Was he imagining things, or had there been a genuine shift in Andy's behavior since their marriage? His musings were interrupted by the sound of Andy's door opening and closing softly. Curious, he rose from his chair and moved to the study doorway. Through the window, he could see her slim figure walking across the lawn toward the pool house, phone pressed to her ear. The night was warm, but not warm enough for a midnight swim. Frank hesitated, torn between his natural inclination to respect her privacy and a growing unease. Finally, curiosity won out. He made his way through the house and out the side door, approaching the pool house quietly. The structure was dark, except for the glow of what must have been Andy's phone screen through the windows. As he drew closer, he could hear her voice, low and intense. He moved to the side of the building, where the window was cracked open to let in the night breeze. "Everything's going according to plan," he heard Andy say. "Better than expected, actually. He trusts me completely." There was a pause as she listened to the person on the other end. "Don't be impatient," she continued. "These things take time. We need to be smart about this. His health is actually improving, which complicates the timeline a bit." Another pause. "Of course, I'm sure about the will. I was right there when he signed it. Everything goes to me when he's gone, with some minor exceptions for his former neighbor. The old fool thinks I'm going to build some kind of senior care paradise with his money." She laughed, a sound so devoid of warmth that Frank barely recognized it as coming from the woman he knew. As if, Frank felt as though the ground had shifted beneath his feet. He gripped the wall of the pool house for support, his heart pounding uncomfortably in his chest. "The best part?" Andy continued, her voice dropping even lower. "He has no idea about the baby. Can you imagine his face if he knew I was pregnant? And not with his child, obviously." The person on the other end said something that made her laugh again. "Matt, you're terrible. But yes, we'll be set for life once this plays out. Just a few more months, maybe a year at most. His health will decline eventually. They all do at his age. And when it does, I'll be the grieving young widow, pregnant with a child he'll never meet. No one will question my inheritance then." Frank stepped back, a sick feeling spreading through his stomach. The movement caused a twig to snap beneath his foot. A small sound, but enough in the quiet night. "Hold on," Andy said sharply. "I think I heard something." Frank didn't wait to be discovered. He moved as quickly and quietly as his age and condition would allow, making it back to the house and his study, before he heard the pool house door open. Through the window, he watched Andy step out, scanning the yard suspiciously before returning to her call. He sat heavily in his chair, his mind reeling from what he'd overheard. The betrayal cut deeper than he could have imagined. Not just the calculated deception, but the cold dismissal of everything he'd believed they shared. The plans for the elder care facility, the mutual respect, the companionship that had eased his loneliness. It had all been a lie, a carefully constructed performance designed to secure his fortune. And now she was pregnant with another man's child. The irony was almost too much to bear. After a lifetime of wanting children, of grieving the family he and Martha never had, he was being used as a proxy father figure for a child conceived in betrayal. His first instinct was confrontation, to call Andy into his study immediately and expose her scheme. But as the initial shock subsided, a cooler, more strategic part of his brain asserted itself. The same instinct for calculated risk that had built his business empire now urged caution. If he confronted her directly, she would simply deny everything. It would be his word against hers, and he had no proof beyond what he'd overheard. No, this situation required careful planning. Andy had underestimated him, assuming that age had dulled his wits along with his body. It was time to show her, and this Matt person, exactly whom they were dealing with. Frank picked up his phone and composed a text message to Margaret. "Need to talk. Privately. Can you come by tomorrow while Andy is at class? Urgent." Margaret's reply came almost immediately despite the late hour. 10 a.m. I'll bring coffee." The next morning, Frank maintained a facade of normalcy at breakfast, discussing Andy's upcoming classes and his own plans for the day. If she noticed anything amiss in his demeanor, she gave no indication of it. Her performance was flawless, the concerned, attentive wife suggesting he take it easy, reminding him to take his medications. Each solicitous comment now rang hollow to his ears. How had he not seen through it before? Had loneliness made him so vulnerable, so eager to believe in her apparent affection? After Andy left for her classes, Frank paced his study, rehearsing what he would tell Margaret. He needed her help, but he also dreaded the inevitable "I told you so" that would accompany it. Margaret had seen what he had been too blind to recognize. At precisely 10 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Frank opened it to find Margaret on his doorstep, a tray of coffee balanced in one hand, and a concerned expression on her face. "You look terrible," she said by way of greeting, stepping past him into the foyer. "Didn't you sleep?" "Not much," Frank admitted, leading her to the kitchen. "I discovered something last night. Something about Andy." Margaret set down the coffee tray and turned to face him, her expression grave. "I've been waiting for this conversation." "What happened?" Frank recounted what he'd overheard, watching as Margaret's concern transformed into anger and then grim determination. "That manipulative little—" Margaret bit off the word. "I knew something wasn't right about her. The way she ingratiated herself so quickly, how she always had an answer for everything. What are you going to do?" Frank sighed, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "That's why I asked you here. I need your help figuring that out." Margaret nodded, her practical nature already turning to solutions. "First, we need to document everything. Write down exactly what you heard, when you heard it. Then we contact your attorney, quietly, without Andy knowing." "There's more to consider," Frank said. "She's pregnant." Margaret's eyebrows shot up. "And obviously not by you." "Obviously," Frank agreed dryly, "but that complicates things. Whatever we do, there's an innocent child involved now." Margaret studied him with a mixture of admiration and exasperation. "Even now, you're thinking of others. That's always been your strength and your weakness, Frank." They spent the next hour outlining a plan. Discreet consultations with Frank's attorney, changes to his will and financial arrangements, gathering evidence of Andy's deception. By the time Margaret left, Frank felt more in control of the situation, though the ache of betrayal still throbbed beneath his composure. What Andy didn't know was that Frank Williams had not built his business empire by being easily fooled or outmaneuvered. He had faced setbacks before, competitors who had underestimated him, challenges that would have broken lesser men. This was just one more battle to fight, perhaps his last, but potentially his most important. As he closed the door behind Margaret, a new resolve straightened his shoulders. Andy had chosen the wrong man to deceive, and before this was over, she would learn exactly what that meant. The Texas autumn brought cooler temperatures and painted the landscape in warm hues of red and gold. For Frank, the changing season mirrored the transformation in his own life, a gradual, deliberate shift happening beneath a seemingly unchanged surface. Outwardly, nothing appeared different. He and Andy maintained their routine, their conversations, their public appearances as a happily married couple. Frank played his role flawlessly, allowing her to believe that her deception remained undetected. If she noticed the subtle withdrawal of his trust, the careful distancing of his affections, she gave no sign of it. Behind the scenes, however, Frank worked methodically with his attorney, James Harrington, to restructure his affairs. They met in restaurants far from San Antonio, communicating otherwise through a secure email account that Margaret had helped him set up, precautions that would have seemed paranoid before, but now felt necessary. "The new will is ready for your signature," James told him during one such meeting, sliding a folder across the table in a quiet corner of an Austin steakhouse. "Are you absolutely certain about these provisions?" Frank nodded firmly. "I've given it a lot of thought. This reflects my true wishes." James, who had been Frank's legal counsel for over 30 years, studied him with concern. "It's a complex arrangement. If contested, there could be legal challenges." "That's why I'm paying you the big bucks, James," Frank replied with a hint of his old humor. "To make it challenge-proof." The attorney sighed. "I've done my best. The trust structure is solid. Documentation of your mental competence is thorough. Still, you're making some unusual decisions here." Frank opened the folder, reviewing the document one final time. The new will divided his estate in ways that would shock Andy when eventually revealed. 50% to a trust establishing a residential community for seniors with limited financial means. the Williams-Parker elder community, ensuring that some version of Andy's purported dream would become reality, though not under her control. 30% to Margaret, along with the deed to his home and property. 10% to Ethan Parker, specifically earmarked for medical care and rehabilitation, with strict provisions preventing the funds from being redirected elsewhere. And for Andy herself, just enough to avoid raising suspicions of deliberate disinheritance, 5% of his liquid assets, with one significant condition. The trust for the unborn child is the most important part, Frank reminded James. Ensure that money is absolutely secure until the child reaches adulthood, and the letters, each one to be delivered on the child's birthday, from age 18 to 21. I understand, James assured him. Everything is in place exactly as you specified. Frank signed the documents with a steady hand, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. Whatever happened next, he had secured his legacy. Not the one he had imagined when he married Andy, but perhaps a more meaningful one. "Thank you, old friend," Frank said, shaking James's hand as they parted, "for everything." "Take care of yourself, Frank," the attorney replied, concern evident in his voice, "and call me if anything changes." As autumn progressed, Frank noticed Andy's absences becoming more frequent and prolonged. She began to show physical signs of her pregnancy, though she had yet to mention it to him, a fact that confirmed her duplicity more concretely than anything else could have. In Frank's experience, a woman genuinely expecting a child with her husband would have shared the news with excitement, not hidden it like a shameful secret. One evening in late October, Frank sat in his study, reviewing quarterly reports from his dealerships when he heard Andy's car pull into the driveway. Moments later, she entered the house, her footsteps hesitating before she appeared in his doorway. "You're working late," she observed, an unfamiliar nervousness in her voice. Frank looked up, noting the slight swell of her abdomen partially concealed by her loose blouse. "Just catching up on some paperwork. How was your meeting?" "Productive," she replied vaguely. She twisted her wedding ring, a simple gold band that had been Martha's mother's, around her finger. "Frank, I need to talk to you about something." He set down his papers, giving her his full attention. "I'm listening." Andy stepped fully into the room, closing the door behind her. "I don't know quite how to say this." She took a deep breath. "I'm pregnant." Frank allowed surprise to register on his face, though it was entirely manufactured. "Pregnant? But how?" He stopped, as if processing the impossibility given their arrangement. Andy's cheeks flushed with what appeared to be shame, but which Frank now recognized as carefully practiced deception. "It happened before our marriage," she said softly. "I didn't know until recently. I was with someone, it ended badly, and then I met you and everything moved so quickly." The performance was impressive. Her voice trembled at just the right moments. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. If he hadn't overheard her conversation with this Matt person, Frank might have been entirely convinced. "I understand if you're angry," she continued when he remained silent. "If you want an annulment, No," Frank interrupted, surprising her. He rose from his chair, crossing to where she stood. "I'm not angry, Andy." Confusion flickered across her face. "You're not?" Frank took her hands in his, schooling his features into an expression of compassionate understanding. "Life rarely follows the paths we expect. You're carrying a child, a miracle I've always longed for, but never experienced." Hope, or perhaps relief, brightened her eyes. I mean that I would be honored to raise this child as my own," Frank said, the half-truth coming easily to his lips. He would indeed ensure the child was cared for, though not in the way Andy imagined. "To give him or her my name and my legacy." Andy embraced him then, her relief palpable. "Thank you, Frank. You're a better man than I deserve." The irony of her statement wasn't lost on him. "When is the baby due?" he asked, disengaging from her embrace. "Early April," she replied, her hand moving unconsciously to her stomach. Frank nodded thoughtfully. "We should tell Margaret and make plans for converting one of the guest rooms into a nursery." Over the next few weeks, Frank threw himself into the role of excited, expectant father with enthusiasm that wasn't entirely feigned. Despite everything, the thought of a child in his home, even one conceived in deception, awakened long-dormant paternal instincts. He accompanied Andy to doctor appointments, purchased parenting books, and spent hours online researching the safest cribs and strollers. Margaret, who knew the truth, watched these developments with a mixture of admiration and concern. "You're getting too invested," she warned during one of their private conversations. "Remember what she's done, what she's planning." "I remember," Frank assured her. "But the child is innocent in all this. And playing along gives me more time to finalize everything." November brought a sudden cold snap, and with it a downturn in Frank's health. What began as a simple cold developed into pneumonia, landing him in the hospital for a week. Andy played the part of devoted wife perfectly, staying by his bedside, consulting with doctors, managing his medications. But during his more lucid moments, Frank noticed how her gaze would linger on the monitors tracking his vital signs, the calculating assessment behind her concerned expression. She was measuring his mortality, he realized, adjusting her timeline, perhaps accelerating her plans. After his release from the hospital, Frank's recovery was slower than expected. His energy remained depleted, his breathing sometimes labored. The doctors assured him it was normal after pneumonia at his age, but Frank sensed the change in his body. Time, which had seemed so abundant just months ago, now felt increasingly precious. On a crisp December morning, Frank sat on the patio watching the sun rise over the distant hills. Andy was still asleep, her pregnancy now making her need more rest. Margaret joined him, bringing coffee and her steady presence. "Beautiful morning," she commented, settling into the chair beside him. "Every morning is beautiful when you've seen as many as I have," Frank replied, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "I called James yesterday. Everything is finalized." Margaret nodded, understanding the significance. "Good." They sat in companionable silence, watching the golden light spread across the landscape. "Martha would be proud of you," Margaret said finally. "How you've handled all this." Frank smiled, genuinely touched. "She always was the better person between us. More forgiving." "You've been plenty forgiving," Margaret countered. "More than most would be in your situation." Frank considered this. Not forgiveness, he decided. Justice tempered with compassion, for the child's sake, if nothing else. As Christmas approached, Andy's pregnancy became impossible to conceal. She had developed an unexpected complication, gestational hypertension that required frequent monitoring and reduced activity. Frank insisted on hiring a part-time nurse to check on her daily while he attended to business matters, a suggestion Andy reluctantly accepted. What she didn't know was that the nurse, Sandra, reported directly to Margaret, documenting Andy's activities and visitors while Frank was away. It was through Sandra that they confirmed what Frank had long suspected. Matt, the baby's father, was a regular visitor when Frank was known to be out of the house. "He's about 30, dark hair, arrives in a blue Mustang," Sandra reported during one of her check-ins with Margaret. "They're not even subtle about it, kissing in the kitchen, talking about plans for after—" She stopped abruptly, glancing at Frank. "I'm sorry, that must be difficult to hear." "It's all right," Frank assured her, his expression resigned but determined. "I need to know what I'm dealing with." As January turned to February, Frank's health deteriorated further. His doctors identified a heart condition exacerbated by the earlier pneumonia, recommending medication and lifestyle changes, but warning that at his age, the prognosis was uncertain. Frank accepted this news with the same quiet dignity with which he had faced every challenge in his life. Andy became increasingly attentive as his condition worsened, though Frank now recognized the predatory nature of her concern. She insisted on managing his medications herself, an offer he politely but firmly declined, citing the nurse's professional expertise. If Andy was disappointed by this refusal, she hid it well. One evening in early March, as a spring storm raged outside, Frank experienced severe chest pains that prompted another hospitalization. Tests revealed a minor heart attack, survivable, but a clear warning sign of his fragility. "You need to take it easy," Dr. Etoile Ramirez advised during her rounds the next morning. "Minimize stress, follow your medication regimen precisely." From his hospital bed, Frank nodded obediently, though he knew the coming weeks would bring unavoidable stress. Andy's due date was approaching, and with it, the culmination of plans long in the making, both hers and his own. Upon his return home, Frank found Andy uncharacteristically anxious, hovering nearby as he settled back into his routine. "The doctor said you need to rest," she reminded him repeatedly. "You shouldn't be working or worrying about anything." "I'm fine, Andy," he reassured her, noting the way her eyes kept darting to the medical alert button he now wore around his neck. "Focus on taking care of yourself and the baby. April will be here before we know it." That night, as a gentle rain tapped against the windows, Frank sat in his study writing a final letter, not for the legal documents James had prepared, but for Andy herself. The words came easily, flowing from a place of clarity and purpose he hadn't felt in months. When he finished, he sealed the letter in an envelope, writing "For Andrea" on the front in his distinctive script. He placed it in his desk drawer alongside a copy of his will, documents she would inevitably discover in the aftermath of what was to come. The following week brought unexpected developments. Andy's blood pressure spiked dangerously during a routine checkup, resulting in an emergency admission to the hospital. The doctors decided to induce labor 3 weeks early to protect both mother and child. Frank received the call while meeting with James for a final review of his arrangements. "It's happening now," he told his attorney, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "Everything needs to be ready." James nodded grimly. "It is. I'll be standing by." At the hospital, Frank found Andy already in active labor, her face contorted with pain and fear. Despite everything, he felt a surge of compassion for her in that vulnerable moment. He took her hand, allowing her to squeeze it through contractions, while medical staff moved efficiently around them. "I'm scared," she admitted during a brief respite between pains, her defenses temporarily lowered by the intensity of the experience. "You're doing beautifully," Frank assured her, meaning it, "and I'm right here." 8 hours later, Emma Grace Parker Williams entered the world with a powerful cry that echoed through the delivery room. Frank, standing at Andy's side, felt his heart constrict at the sight of the tiny, red-faced infant with a shock of dark hair. "She's perfect," he whispered, genuine wonder in his voice as a nurse placed the swaddled newborn in Andy's arms. Andy's expression as she gazed at her daughter contained the first authentic emotion Frank had seen from her in months, a fierce, protective love that transcended all calculation and deception. In that moment, despite everything that had transpired between them, Frank felt a glimmer of hope for both mother and child. 2 days later, Andy and Emma came home to a house prepared for their arrival. Frank had insisted on hiring a night nurse for the first few weeks. "To help you recover while I'm still regaining my own strength," he explained when Andy initially protested. The nursery was fully equipped, painted in soft yellows and greens that caught the morning light. Life settled into a new rhythm dictated by Emma's feeding schedule and Frank's medication regimen. Andy, consumed by the demands of new motherhood, seemed less focused on Frank's health and more genuinely invested in their shared household. There were moments, watching her sing softly to Emma or seeing her fast asleep with the baby nestled against her chest, when Frank almost believed in the possibility of redemption. But then he would catch her on the phone in hushed conversation or notice a text message from Matt lighting up her screen, and reality would reassert itself. The game was still being played, just with adjusted parameters. As March gave way to April, Frank's strength continued to decline. His doctors adjusted his medications, but the underlying issues remained. He began putting his affairs in order with a methodical precision that would have made Martha proud. Organizing files, creating instruction manuals for his classic cars, ensuring every detail was accounted for. One afternoon, while Andy was napping with Emma, Frank sat with Margaret on the patio, watching hummingbirds dart around the feeder Martha had installed years ago. "I don't have much time left," he said simply, his voice matter-of-fact rather than fearful. Margaret reached for his hand, her grip firm despite her arthritis. "Don't talk like that. It's not fear speaking, Margaret. Just reality." Frank turned to face his oldest friend. "I need you to promise me something. Watch over Emma. Make sure she knows the truth when the time comes, not to hurt her, but so she understands her history." "I promise," Margaret replied solemnly. "That child will know she was loved by you, regardless of circumstances." 2 days later, Frank woke before dawn, a strange calm settling over him. He dressed carefully in his favorite suit, the one he'd worn to his last anniversary dinner with Martha, and made his way to his study. There he placed a framed photograph of Martha on his desk, alongside a newer one of baby Emma. He wrote a final note to add to the envelope for Andy, his handwriting shakier than usual but still legible. As the first rays of sunrise painted the room in golden light, Frank felt a tightness in his chest that was familiar but more intense than before. He didn't reach for his medication or his alert button. Instead, he looked at Martha's photograph and smiled. "I'm coming home, my love," he whispered. When Andy found him an hour later, he was sitting peacefully in his chair, his expression serene, as if he had simply decided it was time to rest. She screamed, called for help, performed CPR with desperate efficiency. But Frank Williams had already departed, on his own terms and by his own choice. The following days passed in a blur of arrangements, phone calls and visitors. Andy played the role of grieving widow flawlessly, her eyes appropriately red-rimmed, her voice breaking at just the right moments. Only Margaret saw through the performance, noting how Andy's gaze would drift to Frank's office, where his financial documents were kept, when she thought no one was watching. The funeral was well attended, a testament to the many lives Frank had touched throughout his years in San Antonio. Business associates, former employees, charity representatives, and neighbors filled the church. Ethan sat in the front row beside his sister, his expression unreadable as the minister spoke of Frank's generosity and community spirit. A week after the funeral, James Harrington called to schedule the reading of the will. "My office Thursday at 2, he said, his tone giving nothing away. "All interested parties should attend." On the appointed day, Andy arrived at the attorney's office, dressed in subdued black, Emma sleeping peacefully in her carrier. She appeared confident, the slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth suggesting she was already mentally spending her inheritance. Margaret was already seated in the conference room, along with Ethan and several community representatives whose presence clearly confused Andy. James began the proceedings with formal solemnity, reading through the legal preamble before getting to the heart of the matter. As he detailed the distribution of assets, Andy's expression transformed from confidence to disbelief to barely controlled fury. "This can't be right," she interrupted when James explained the Elder Care Community Trust. "Frank and I discussed his estate. He wanted to provide for me and Emma." "He has provided for Emma," James replied evenly. "Quite generously, in fact. The trust in her name will ensure her education and welfare throughout her life." Andy's cheeks flushed with anger. "And what about me? 5%? After everything I did for him?" The slip caused several heads to turn in her direction. James merely consulted his notes. "There's also this," he said, handing her the envelope Frank had prepared. "Mr. Williams requested you read this privately." Andy snatched the envelope, her hands trembling with suppressed rage. "This isn't over," she hissed, gathering Emma's carrier and storming from the room. Later that evening, alone in what had been Frank's study, Andy finally opened the envelope. Inside, she found a letter written in Frank's distinctive handwriting, along with a printed copy of the pool house conversation he had overheard months earlier, transcribed word for word, dated and notarized. "Dear Andrea, if you're reading this, I've left this world on my own terms, something I've always valued, the ability to choose my own path. I know about your arrangement with Matthew Cooper. I know about your plans for my money, your dismissal of the elder care facility dream you claim to share, and your intentions regarding my death. I could have confronted you, could have ended our arrangement publicly and with recrimination. Instead, I chose a different path, one that honors Martha's memory and my own values. The elder care community will be built. Your brother will receive the medical care he genuinely needs. Margaret, who has been a true friend to me, will be comfortable for the rest of her life. And Emma, innocent in all of this, will have everything she needs for a bright future. As for you, you receive enough to avoid the appearance of deliberate disinheritance, but not enough to satisfy the greed that drove you to deceive a lonely old man. The prenuptial agreement you signed without reading carefully ensures you cannot contest these arrangements successfully. I don't write this out of anger or revenge, though both would be justified. I write it because even now, I believe in the possibility of change. Emma deserves a mother who values more than money, who understands that true wealth lies in character and compassion. When Emma turns 18, she will receive the first of 3 letters I've written to her, explaining everything that transpired between us. How she processes that truth will depend largely on the woman you choose to become in the intervening years. The path forward is yours to determine. Choose wisely for Emma's sake, if not your own. Frank Williams. Andy crumpled the letter in her fist, a sob of frustration escaping her lips. Outside the study window, she could see Margaret in the garden, planting spring flowers with the same care Martha had once shown. In her bassinet nearby, Emma slept peacefully, unaware of the drama unfolding around her tiny life. In that moment, faced with the consequences of her actions and the unexpected wisdom of the man she had underestimated, something shifted in Andy's understanding. The carefully constructed facade she had maintained for so long cracked, revealing a glimpse of the person she might have been, might still become if she could find the courage to choose differently. 6 months later, on a bright autumn day, much like the one when Frank had first proposed their arrangement, Margaret stood in the newly broken ground where the Williams Parker elder community would soon rise. Beside her, Andy held Emma, now a chubby, smiling baby with Frank's thoughtful eyes. "He outplayed us both," Andy admitted quietly, watching the construction crews prepare the foundation. "Matt's gone. Took off when he realized there wasn't going to be a windfall." Margaret nodded, unsurprised. "Frank was always thinking 3 moves ahead. It's what made him successful in business. And he was right about me," Andy continued, her voice stronger now. "About the choices I needed to make for Emma's sake. The nursing program she had re-enrolled in was demanding, especially while caring for an infant, but Andy had discovered a genuine passion for geriatric care that surprised even her. The board position Frank had arranged for her at the Community Foundation, a detail revealed only after his passing, provided both income and purpose during this transition. "Do you think he really forgave me?" Andy asked, bouncing Emma gently as the baby began to fuss. "Or was that just his final move in the game?" Margaret considered the question seriously. Frank wasn't a saint, despite what everyone said at his funeral. He was capable of anger, of wanting justice, but he was also capable of profound compassion. She touched Emma's cheek gently. "I think in the end he chose to give you something more valuable than money, a chance at redemption." As they walked back to Margaret's car, Andy paused to look back at the construction site with its sign announcing "Future Home of the Williams Parker Elder Community, Opening Spring 2026. "I'll make it right," she promised softly, addressing not just Margaret, but the memory of Frank himself. "For Emma, for the residents who will live here, and for myself. That's the real legacy he left me." Margaret smiled, seeing in the younger woman a glimmer of the potential Frank had recognized beneath the deception. He'd be pleased to hear that. Martha, too. Together they drove back to what was now Margaret's home, where Emma's nursery remained intact, and where Andy was welcome for Sunday dinners and holiday celebrations, not out of obligation, but out of a growing appreciation for the family they were unexpectedly becoming. In the study, which remained largely as Frank had left it, Martha and Frank's photographs watched over them all, witnesses to the strange, winding path that had brought them together and the shared future they were now building, bound by the legacy of a man who had learned that true wealth was measured not in dollars, but in lives touched and hearts changed. Fim da Historia. Thank you for sticking with us until the end. We hope Frank and Andrea's story moved you, and maybe even taught you something about legacy, redemption, and the power of compassion. If you enjoyed this journey, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that like button. It helps us bring more stories like this one to viewers like you. We publish new emotional stories every day, so feel free to explore and find your favorite. What did you think about Frank's final act of wisdom? Did Andrea deserve her second chance? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'll see you tomorrow with another unforgettable story.